I screamed in pain all night on the cold floor, but my daughter just turned off the light. A week later, I placed a legal folder on the dinner table that ended their free ride and destroyed their entitled lives forever. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The folder hit the mahogany table with a sound like a gavel, and for the first time in years, the air in my own dining room didn't feel like it was running out. I watched my daughter Jennifer slice into her chicken with a rhythmic scraping precision that set my teeth on edge. Across from her, Douglas leaned back, his arms folded over a chest that had never known the sweat of a hard day's labor. I had just told them the bank approved a credit line for $35,000, money I had squeezed out of my own retirement security, yet the silence following the news was heavy with a familiar looming greed. "Newton, that is simply not going to be enough," Jennifer said, setting her fork down with a sharp click against the ceramic. "We did the math again this morning. To actually scale the bakery and handle the new ventilation codes, we need at least double that. 70,000 is the real number." The blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice. I had spent 4 weeks in the back offices of the bank, showing the loan officer my fixed income statements and the equity in this house, all to secure the 35,000 they had begged for just a month ago. I reminded her of that, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. I told her I had brought exactly what they asked for to cover the new ovens and the renovation. Douglas let out a short, dry laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. "Let's be realistic," he said, using that flat, condescending tone he always adopted when he wanted to remind me I was just the landlord of their lives. 35,000 won't even get the electrical work signed off. You have to be flexible, Newton. In entrepreneurship, you either adapt or you die. He never called me dad. Not once in the 4 years they had lived under my roof, eating my food and using my utilities without contributing a single cent. Jennifer reached out and slid the folder back toward me. She didn't even look at the documents I had signed that morning, the ones that put my credit rating on a chopping block for her future. She pushed them aside like they were junk mail. "Honestly, Dad, you really should consider downsizing," she said, her voice taking on that fake, reasonable tone she used for difficult customers. "This house is 3 floors. You're here alone. If you sold this place and moved into a nice modern apartment with maintenance included, we would have the real capital we need to make the business a success." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my chair. This was the home where I had raised her, the home I had paid for by working 2 teaching jobs for 30 years. I looked at her, 36 years old and sitting in the spot where she had once cried after her mother's funeral, and I realized she wasn't seeing a home. She was seeing an asset to be liquidated. I told her quietly about the $28,000 I paid for her wedding and the $50,000 I gave them to start the business. I asked if this was really how she responded to a father who had given everything. "Parenthood is a responsibility you chose, Newton," Douglas interjected, eyes locked on his phone. "You don't get a trophy for doing what you're supposed to do. Besides, Jennifer is right. What if you fall on these stairs? You're getting older. A ground-level flat is just safer." I stood up, my chair scraping the hardwood like a scream. I didn't say a word. I grabbed the folder, feeling the crinkle of the paper against my chest, and walked toward the stairs. Behind me, the television clicked on, a sitcom audience roaring at a joke I couldn't hear. I climbed toward my bedroom, the wood groaning under my feet, while their laughter drifted up through the floorboards, comfortable and unconcerned. I sat in the darkness of my room, staring at a graduation photo of Jennifer from Arizona State. She had called me her hero that day over a cheap Italian dinner. Now, I was just a bank account with a heartbeat. I pulled my desk drawer open and started pulling out the files, the cold, hard evidence of $113,000 spent on them in just 4 years. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. I needed a glass of water to wash down the bitterness, so I eased my door open and stepped into the dark hallway. The stairs were steep, built in 1998, and I knew every inch of them. But on the 4th step from the top, my foot hit something small, hard, and plastic. A toy truck left behind by Douglas's nephew earlier that day. The plastic wheels rolled, my balance vanished, and the world suddenly flipped upside down. My shoulder hit the wood first, then my hip, then my ribs. I was a tumbling weight of bone and pain, crashing down the narrow flight until I landed in a twisted heap on the cold tile of the entryway. I tried to gasp, but my lungs wouldn't expand. White fire lanced through my chest, and when I tried to move my right leg, it felt like someone was driving a hot iron into my shin. "Jennifer," I wheezed, my voice a broken rasp. "Douglas, help." I fell. Down the hall, a strip of yellow light glowed beneath their bedroom door. The television was a muffled murmur. I waited, my cheek pressed to the freezing tile, expecting the door to fly open and the sound of panicked footsteps, but the light stayed steady. The door didn't move. I called out again, louder this time, the effort sending a fresh wave of agony through my shattered ribs. "I'm hurt," I screamed, or tried to. "Please, I can't get up." The house was silent for 5 seconds. Then, the strip of light beneath their door vanished. The darkness that followed was absolute. I lay there, listening to the silence of my own home, unable to process the fact that they had heard me and simply turned off the light. My right leg throbbed with a heavy, sickening heat, and my left wrist was already swelling into a shape that didn't look human. Every shallow breath was a gamble with the jagged edges of my ribs. I tried to drag myself toward the kitchen, toward the phone on the counter, but the first movement sent a jolt of electricity through my spine that blacked out my vision. I collapsed back onto the tile, a small cry escaping my lips. The house absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. I shivered as the midnight cold seeped out of the floor and into my marrow, my muscles locking into a permanent cramp. Hours crawled by. I drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, my mind replaying the realtor's call from 3 years ago. She had offered $520,000 in cash for the house. Jennifer had cried, begging me not to sell the family home, telling me it was all we had left of her mother. I had stayed for her. I had kept the stairs and the maintenance and the taxes for her. Now, I was dying on the floor of that same house while she slept 30 feet away. A soft click echoed in the hallway. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the haze of pain. Douglas appeared at the edge of the darkness, wearing a t-shirt and boxers, padding toward the kitchen with the casual gait of someone looking for a midnight snack. He didn't even have his phone out for light. He knew the path. "Douglas," I whispered, my voice raw and cracking. "Please." I fell. "I think my leg is broken." He opened the refrigerator. The blue-white light spilled across the kitchen, illuminating the professional-grade appliances I had paid for. He pulled out a water bottle, cracked the seal, and took a long, slow drink. Then he turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, filled with a bored-flat annoyance. "Stop being so dramatic, Newton," he said, his voice level and dry. "You'll get up when you're tired of lying there. I have an early morning at the bakery. Don't wake Jennifer." He recapped the bottle, walked past me close enough that I could smell the laundry detergent on his shirt, and disappeared back into the hallway. The bedroom door closed with a final mechanical click. I lay in the renewed darkness, the refrigerator humming in the distance, and felt something inside me break that no surgeon would ever be able to fix. The sun began to bleed through the front window around 6 Mile, turning the entryway into a gallery of gray shadows. I watched the dust motes dancing in the light, my mind working with a cold, terrifying clarity. They weren't coming to help. They were waiting for me to give up. If I died on this floor, they would find me tonight, call 911, and put on a show of grief for the neighbors while they calculated the inheritance tax. At 7:15, the bedroom door opened again. Footsteps, the sound of the shower, the mundane clatter of a morning routine. Jennifer emerged, dressed in her bakery logo shirt, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She walked into the hallway, her eyes landing on me as I lay in the same spot I had been for 9 hours. "Dad, enough with the theater," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "We're already running late because we didn't sleep well with all your noise last night. We'll talk about this behavior when we get home." She stepped over my outstretched, mangled leg to reach for her purse on the coat hook. Douglas followed her, grabbing his keys and jangling them right above my head. The sound was like a physical blow. They walked out the front door, the lock clicking into place, and the rumble of Douglas's sedan faded down the street until there was nothing left but the silence of the morning. I was alone. Truly, finally alone. My right leg had gone numb, a heavy wrongness that terrified me. I looked at the front door, the wood grain mocking me. I had assets. I had a house worth over $500,000. I had retirement accounts. I just had to survive long enough to take them back. 10 minutes later, a shadow crossed the front window. It was Harold Chen, my neighbor from across the street. He was out watering his roses, and I saw him pause, looking at the newspaper still sitting on my porch. He walked up the steps, his face twisting with confusion as he peered through the glass. He knocked, calling my name, asking if I was okay. "Help," I croaked, the word barely a vibration in the air. Harold didn't hesitate. He tried the handle, found it locked, and immediately pulled out his phone. I heard him through the door, his voice rising in panic as he told the dispatcher he had an elderly man down on the floor who hadn't moved. He stayed at the glass, talking to me, telling me to hang on, that help was coming. When the sirens finally cut through the suburban quiet, I closed my eyes and let out a breath that felt like a sob. The paramedics were through the door in seconds, their heavy boots thumping on the tile. A young woman knelt beside me, her hands efficient and cool as she checked my pulse. "Since last night," I managed to say as they cut away my shirt. "I fell at midnight." The paramedic looked at Harold, then back at me, her expression hardening into something professional and grim. "9 hours, she whispered. "You're lucky you're breathing, sir." They stabilized my leg with a splint that sent white fire through my brain, and as they lifted me onto the gurney, I saw the toy truck still sitting on the 4th step. I looked at the house one last time as they wheeled me out into the blinding August sun. I was alive, and for the first time in 40 years, I knew exactly what I had to do. The hospital room at Banner University Medical Center smelled of bleach and failed expectations. My leg was encased in a heavy cast, 3 of my ribs were taped tight, and my wrist was wrapped in a thick compression bandage. The doctor had been blunt. 3 broken ribs, a fractured tibia, and a severe sprain. He told me that 9 hours on a cold floor at 64 could have ended in a pulmonary embolism or internal bleeding. He called me lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a man who had finally seen the monster under the bed, and the monster had his daughter's face. Jennifer didn't show up until 2:30 in the afternoon. She walked into the room with her purse clutched to her side like a shield, her expression hovering somewhere between a grimace and a sigh. She didn't come to the bedside. She stayed by the door, maintaining a distance that felt like a border crossing. "Dad, why did you have to make such a scene?" she asked, her voice carrying that same strained, annoyed pitch. "You could have just waited until we got home." Calling the neighbors and the ambulance was so unnecessary. I stared at her, my vision blurred by the pain medication, but my mind sharper than a razor. I told her I couldn't move, that I had called for them for hours, and that they had heard me. "We thought you were just trying to get attention," she countered, crossing her arms. "You were so upset about the money at dinner, and then suddenly you're screaming in the middle of the night. It felt like you were trying to manipulate us." The doctor stepped into the room then, his eyes flicking from Jennifer to my chart. He didn't know the history, but he knew medicine. He told her flatly that my injuries were life-threatening given the delay in treatment. He said if I hadn't been found when I was, I might not have made it to the weekend. Jennifer's face flickered for a second, not with guilt, but with the frustration of being proven wrong. "We thought he was faking," she told the doctor, her voice defiant. "He does things for drama sometimes." I had never staged a drama in my life. I had been the steady hand, the one who paid the bills and fixed the leaks and kept the peace. I looked at her and realized that she had to believe I was faking, because the alternative, that she was the kind of person who could leave her father to die, was something her ego couldn't handle. "Leave," I said, the word quiet but absolute. "I don't want you here right now." She looked relieved. She didn't argue. She didn't offer to bring me anything from home. She just turned and walked out, the door clicking shut with that same finality I had heard on the stairs. I spent the next 3 days in that bed, staring at the white ceiling and planning. I wasn't just going to get even, I was going to get free. I used my phone to search for the best estate planning and elder law attorneys in Phoenix. I needed someone who didn't just write wills, but built fortresses. That was when I found Richard Caldwell. On the day of my discharge, Harold Chen was the one who picked me up. He helped me into a wheelchair and drove me back to the house, his steady hand on my elbow as I maneuvered the crutches through my own front door. He told me to call him for anything, and when he left, I sat in the silence of my living room and looked at the boxes of bakery supplies stacked against my walls. I made my way to the den, my crutches thumping on the carpet. I opened my laptop and filled out the consultation form for Caldwell's office. I listed my needs: property trust, asset protection, and immediate financial restructuring. By the time I heard Douglas's sedan rattle into the driveway at 6:30, the appointment was set for the following morning. Jennifer came in with bags of Thai food, her voice loud and fake as she asked how I was feeling. She acted like the last few days had been a minor misunderstanding, a little bump in the road of our perfect family life. Douglas sat on the couch, not even looking up from his phone. They waited until the spring rolls were on the plates before Jennifer brought it up. "So, about that $35,000, Dad. We really need you to call the bank and authorize the transfer tomorrow. The suppliers are threatening to cut us off." I took a slow sip of water, feeling the ache in my ribs. I told them we would discuss financial matters later, that I was focusing on my recovery. Douglas's jaw tightened. Jennifer opened her mouth to argue, but I just looked at her, my eyes cold and empty, until she looked away. The next morning, I was in Richard Caldwell's office on the 7th floor of a glass building downtown. I told him everything. I showed him the medical records, the bank statements, and the timeline of the last 4 years. I told him I wanted the house out of my name and into a trust. I wanted the loan guarantee revoked, and I wanted a formal rental agreement for the people living in my guest rooms. Caldwell leaned back, his eyes sharp. "Mr. Diaz, what happened to you is unconscionable," he said. "We can have the trust drafted in 3 days. The loan revocation is a letter away. And the eviction notice? That's a 30-day clock that starts the moment we serve them. Do it," I said. "All of it." I spent the next 48 hours signing papers. I met with a notary named Patricia Gomez, a woman who didn't blink when I told her I was cutting my only daughter out of my estate. I signed the documents that moved my home into a revocable living trust with a charity as the successor beneficiary. I signed the letter to First National Bank of Arizona. On August 22nd, I sat at my desk and hit send on the email to the bank officer. My finger hovered over the key for 3 seconds, thinking about the graduation photo in the other room. Then I clicked. The message disappeared. The bridge was gone, and the fire was just beginning. The phone rang the next afternoon. It was Robert Chen from the bank. His voice was professional, but I could hear the confusion underneath. He confirmed that they had received my revocation, and that since I was the sole guarantor, the business loan for the bakery was now technically in default. They were going to call the primary borrowers, Jennifer and Douglas, immediately to demand new collateral or a $20,000 payment to stabilize the account. I told him I understood. I told him it was necessary. By the time Jennifer and Douglas got home that evening, the air in the house was vibrating with their panic. They didn't even bother with the fake pleasantries or the Thai food. They stormed into the living room where I was sitting with my leg propped up, my folder of legal documents resting on my lap like a loaded weapon. "What did you do?" Jennifer screamed, her face blotchy and red. "The bank just called. They're demanding $20,000 by the 10th, or they're shutting us down. They said you revoked the guarantee. You can't do that, Dad. That's our livelihood." Douglas stood behind her, his hands balled into fists. "You're obligated to help your family, Newton. This is a betrayal. We're going to lose everything." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the coffee table. I told them it was a revocable living trust. I explained that the house was no longer mine. It belonged to the trust, and I had designated a successor who wasn't Jennifer. I watched her face go pale as she realized the inheritance she had been counting on to bail out her failures had evaporated. Then I slid the second document forward. I told them it was the loan revocation. I reminded them that a guarantee is a privilege, not a right, and that after lying on the floor for 9 hours, I no longer felt like a guarantor. But the third document was the one that broke the silence. I told them that since they had no written lease and paid no rent, they were technically month-to-month tenants at will. I told them that starting September 1st, they would be paying $2,400 a month in rent, which was actually below market rate for the neighborhood. I told them they could pay, or they could leave. "You're charging us rent," Douglas roared, taking a step toward me. "We'll sue you. There are laws against this. You can't just throw your daughter out on the street." I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out the fourth document. It was a notarized statement from Harold Chen, describing exactly what he saw through the window and what I had told him about being ignored while I was broken on the floor. Clipped behind it were the x-rays from the hospital and the doctor's notes about the 9-hour delay. "By all means, let's go to court," I said, my voice as cold as the tile I had slept on. "I'd love to have a judge hear how you stepped over your injured father to go to work. I'm sure your bakery customers would love to read about it in the local news. We can make the whole thing very public, Douglas." The fight drained out of him so fast he almost stumbled. He stared at the x-rays, at the white lines of the fractures in my ribs, and he realized that I wasn't the old ATM anymore. I was a man who had nothing left to lose because they had already taken it. Jennifer made a small, choked sound in her throat. "We thought you were faking," she whispered again, but the words had no weight. I told her that Douglas had looked me in the eye at 1 a.m. and told me to stop being dramatic. I told her she had walked around my leg to get her purse. I told them they had heard me call for help, and they had chosen to go to sleep. "You have until September 1st to decide about the rent," I said. "If you don't pay, the eviction notice gives you 30 days to vacate. Either way, the free ride is over." I picked up my crutches and stood, leaving them sitting on the couch, surrounded by the evidence of their own cruelty. I walked to my room and closed the door, and for the first time in 4 years, I turned the lock. The next week was a slow-motion car crash that I watched from the safety of my porch. The argument started that night, sharp biting exchanges through the walls. Jennifer blamed Douglas for being rude to me. Douglas blamed Jennifer for not managing her father better. Their marriage, which had been held together by the glue of my money, was beginning to pull apart at the seams. On August 26th, I found Jennifer at the kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills. She was on the phone with another bank, her voice desperate as she tried to secure a $20,000 personal loan. I watched her from the doorway as she was rejected, her posture slumping further with every no. They had no collateral, they had no credit, they had nothing but a failing bakery and a father who had finally stopped saying yes. By the 28th, the bakery was imploding. I overheard them talking about the suppliers cutting them off. They couldn't make the menu items because they couldn't pay for the flour and the butter. Revenue was dropping. The staff was quit because their checks were bouncing. It was a cascade of failure that they had built on a foundation of my sacrifice. On August 29th, a certified letter arrived from First National Bank. It was an acceleration notice. Because they couldn't provide the $20,000, the bank was calling in the entire $55,000 balance of the loan. Everything they had worked for was going to be liquidated by the end of the month. I stayed in my room, reading my books and keeping my routines. I wasn't happy about their suffering, but I wasn't going to stop it. These were the natural consequences of their choices. I was simply the one who had stopped absorbing the impact for them. On the evening of August 30th, Jennifer knocked on my door. She was crying, real tears this time, the kind that come when the floor finally gives way. She sat in the chair in my room and begged me for help. She told me they were going to lose the business and their savings. She said she knew they were wrong and she was sorry. I told her that sorry didn't give me back those 9 hours on the floor. I told her that sorry didn't erase the memory of her stepping over my broken body. I told her she had 2 options: pay the rent or find somewhere else to stay. There would be no more money. She looked at me, searching for the soft spot, the weakness she had exploited for years, but she found nothing but a man who had learned to value his own life. She stood up and walked out, her defeat visible in every line of her body. On September the 1st, a check for $2,400 appeared under my door. It had rent written in the memo line. It was the first time they had ever paid their way in this house. It was 4 years late, but it was there. The next day, they started selling the equipment. I watched as the industrial mixers and the ovens were hauled out of the house and loaded into trucks. They were liquidating their dreams to pay off the bank. Douglas found a job managing someone else's cafe across town, and Jennifer landed an administrative role in a medical office. Their lifestyle collapsed overnight into something small and difficult. By the middle of the month, they were in couples therapy, trying to fix the cracks in their relationship. Jennifer started calling me every few days, not to ask for money, but to ask how my physical therapy was going. She offered to pick up my groceries. She was making small, consistent gestures, trying to rebuild a bridge that she had burned to the ground. I told her I didn't know if I could forgive her yet. I told her that our relationship had to be different, built on respect, not obligation. She nodded, her eyes filled with a raw, honest shame I had never seen before. She said she would show me however long it took. By late September, they moved out. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe, an older building that smelled of old carpet and reality. They paid their own utilities and managed their own lives. The house was quiet again. My house. I sat in my reading chair on the last Saturday of the month, watching the afternoon light slant through the windows. My leg was out of the cast, my ribs were healed, and the trust documents were filed away in the desk. I was 64 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely at peace. Not because I had won, but because I had finally learned that the most important person to protect was the man in the mirror. The front door opened, and Jennifer walked in. She wasn't carrying an invoice or a request. She was carrying a bag of groceries and a smile that looked like it had been earned. "Ready to start on that garage, Dad?" she asked. I stood up, moving without crutches, and followed her into the sun. The silence of the house was different now that they were gone. It wasn't the lonely silence of a widower, but the clean, sharp quiet of a man who had cleared the weeds from his garden. I stood in the center of the kitchen, watching the steam rise from my coffee, and realized I didn't have to brace myself for the sound of Douglas's heavy, entitled footsteps or Jennifer's sigh of disappointment. I had reclaimed my territory. My leg ached only slightly as I walked to the den to retrieve the mail I had ignored during the final moving day. Among the circulars and utility bills was a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to me. No, not to me, to the trust. It was a formal notice from a local developer. They were inquiring about the property again. They offered $580,000, nearly $60,000 more than the cash offer I had turned down 3 years ago. Back then, Jennifer's tears had felt like a plea for family legacy. Now, looking at the number, I saw it for what it was: my freedom. The phone on my desk vibrated. It was a text from Jennifer. "Dad, we're settled into the apartment. It's small, but we're making it work. Can I come by Tuesday to help with the gutters?" I stared at the screen. The old Newton would have felt a surge of guilt, wondering if she was cramped or if Douglas was making her life miserable in a 2-bedroom unit. The new Newton simply noted the offer. I called Richard Caldwell's office. I told him about the developer's offer. "Richard, if I sell, does the trust protect the proceeds from any future claims by my daughter?" "Absolutely, Newton." His voice came through the speaker, crisp and professional. "The trust is the owner. You can reinvest that money into a smaller property or a high-yield account, and she won't have a legal leg to stand on until you decide otherwise." I hung up and looked out at the backyard. I had spent 27 years maintaining this lawn. I had painted the fence, fixed the shingles, and paid the mortgage through 2 recessions. It was a beautiful house, but it was also a museum of my grief and their greed. On Tuesday, Jennifer arrived at Tenquillo. She didn't have Douglas with her. She looked tired, her hands rougher than they used to be, likely from the administrative work and the lack of a personal assistant at her own bakery. She didn't ask for a glass of water. She went straight to the garage, pulled out the ladder, and started working. I watched her through the kitchen window for an hour before I went out. I told her she could take a break. We sat on the back porch, the same place where Douglas had told me I was getting older and needed to move. "I'm thinking of selling the house, Jenny," I said quietly. She froze, a handful of dried leaves in her gloved hand. She didn't burst into tears this time. She didn't tell me it was all we had left of Mom. She just looked at the roof and then back at me. "I understand," she said, her voice small but steady. "You deserve to be happy, Dad. This place, it's a lot of work for one person." It was the most honest thing she had said in a decade. But as I went to reach for my coffee, I noticed something in her bag, a legal-sized envelope sticking out of her purse. It was from First National Bank of Arizona. My heart spiked. The bank was still coming for them. "What's that, Jenny?" I pointed to the envelope. She tried to tuck it deeper into the bag, her face flushing. "It's nothing. Just some final paperwork from the bakery's liquidation." "Is the bank suing you?" I asked. She hesitated, then pulled it out. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a notice of a private debt collection. Apparently, Douglas had taken out a high-interest predatory loan in his own name 6 months ago to cover their personal expenses. And now that the bakery was gone, the collectors were threatening to garnish their new wages. "Douglas didn't tell me about it until last night," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He was trying to save face." I looked at the letter. The amount was $12,000. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what I had already given them, but it was a weight that would drown them in their current state. She didn't ask me for the money. She just sat there, shaking. I felt the old pull in my chest, the urge to protect my child. But then I remembered the cold tile. I remembered Douglas walking past me with his water bottle. "I can't help you with that, Jenny," I said, my voice firm. "I know," she said, wiping her eyes. I don't know how we're going to survive Douglas's mistakes anymore." She left an hour later. I stood on the porch and watched her car disappear. I felt a strange prickle on the back of my neck. I turned around and saw a black SUV parked 2 houses down. A man was sitting inside, watching my house. When he saw me look, he didn't pull away. He just sat there. The SUV was there again the next morning, and the morning after that. I mentioned it to Harold over our Wednesday coffee. "I've seen him too," Harold said, his brow furrowed. "He's been asking questions around the neighborhood. He asked me if I knew how many people lived in your house and if you were mentally sound." My blood ran cold. Someone was digging. I called Richard Caldwell immediately. "Newton, stay calm," Richard said. "It could be the debt collectors looking for leverage against Jennifer and Douglas. If they think you're going to bail them out, they might be trying to pressure you." But it was worse than that. That evening, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't Harold. It was a man in a cheap suit with a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as an investigator for Adult Protective Services. "We received an anonymous tip, Mr. Diaz," he said, stepping into my entryway, the same spot where I had lain in agony. "The report claims you've been showing signs of cognitive decline and that you're being financially exploited by unnamed parties who have convinced you to move your assets into a trust." I stared at him, my hands gripping my cane so hard my knuckles went white. "Exploited? I moved my assets to protect them from the people who left me for dead on this very floor." "The report says otherwise," the investigator said, looking around the living room. "It says you're being coerced by a neighbor and a lawyer who are taking advantage of your post-traumatic state after your fall." An anonymous tip. I knew exactly who had sent it. It wasn't Jennifer. She didn't have the stomach for this kind of calculated cruelty anymore. It was Douglas. He was trying to get the trust invalidated by proving I wasn't of sound mind when I signed it. If he succeeded, the house would go back into my personal estate, and he could argue for conservatorship. I gave the investigator Richard Caldwell's number and showed him the notarized statement from Harold Chen and my medical records from Banner University. I showed him the rental agreement and the eviction notice. "Does this look like the work of a man who doesn't know what he's doing?" I asked, my voice trembling with a cold, quiet rage. The investigator looked at the x-rays of my broken ribs. He looked at the date on Harold's statement. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Diaz." After he left, I didn't sit down. I walked straight to the phone and called Jennifer. "Is Douglas at home?" I asked. "No, he's at the cafe," she said, her voice sounding thin. "Why?" "Tell him he has 24 hours to call off his anonymous friends at APS," I said, the words like stones. "Because if he doesn't, I'm not just cutting you out of the trust, Jenny. I'm going to the police with a full report of elder neglect and reckless endangerment from the night of my fall. I have the witness, I have the medical records, and I have the doorbell camera footage I haven't even told Caldwell about yet." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a sob. "He did what?" she whispered. "He tried to have me declared incompetent, Jenny," I said. "He's trying to steal the house back." "I'll handle it," she said, her voice suddenly turning cold, not toward me, but with a hard, sharp edge I hadn't heard before. I hung up and sat in the dark. I realized then that the war wasn't over. It had just moved from the dining room to the shadows. I reached into my desk and pulled out a small silver thumb drive. It contained the footage from the internal security camera I had installed in the hallway years ago to watch for burglars. I hadn't watched it yet. I hadn't been able to bring myself to see it. I plugged it into the laptop. I fast-forwarded to August 19th, 1:05 a.m. The screen flickered to life. There I was, a crumpled shape on the floor. And there was Douglas. He didn't just walk past me to get water. He stood over me for 30 seconds, watching me struggle to breathe, before he turned and smiled at something on his phone. My hand shook as I closed the laptop. He hadn't just ignored me. He had enjoyed it. The fallout was swifter than I expected. Jennifer didn't just handle Douglas, she dismantled him. The next evening, she arrived at my door with a suitcase and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world. "I left him, Dad," she said, her voice flat and hollow. "When I showed him the APS report and told him what you said, he didn't even deny it. He told me it was the only logical way to secure our future." I let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where she had once told me I didn't need 3 floors for one person. "He's been lying about the debts too," she said, staring into her coffee. "The $12,000 was just the start. He'd used my name on 3 other credit applications. We're in the hole for nearly $40,000 personally, on top of what the bakery lost." I looked at my daughter. For the first time, I didn't see a predator or a spoiled child. I saw a victim of the same monster I had finally escaped. But I didn't offer her money. I didn't tell her she could move back in. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm filing for divorce," she said, her jaw setting in a line that looked remarkably like my own. "And I'm going to work. 2 jobs if I have to. Just like you did." I nodded. "Good." The APS investigator returned 2 days later. I didn't just show him the papers this time. I showed him the video. I watched his face as he saw Douglas standing over me, the blue light of the refrigerator illuminating the contempt on his face. "This isn't an APS matter anymore, Mr. Diaz," the investigator said, his voice grim. "This is a criminal matter. Neglect of a vulnerable adult is a felony in Arizona." Within 48 hours, Douglas was picked up at the cafe. He wasn't just losing his marriage and his business. He was facing a courtroom. Jennifer called me, her voice trembling. "They arrested him, Dad. They said the evidence was overwhelming." "I know," I said. "I'm the one who gave it to them." The social fallout was a tidal wave. In a community like ours, word travels fast. The charming entrepreneur Douglas was now the man who had left his father-in-law to die. The cafe he managed fired him before the bail hearing was even set. His relatives, the ones who had lent him the $20,000, vanished. I sat in my living room and watched the local news. There was his mugshot, a man who had tried to adapt by killing off the person who fed him. Jennifer came by that weekend. She was staying with a coworker, sleeping on a couch and working 10-hour shifts. She helped me pack the last of the crystal from the dining room. We worked in silence for a long time. "Dad," she said, wrapping a glass in newspaper. "Yes, Jenny." "I'm glad you're selling the house," she said. "It shouldn't be a tomb. You should go somewhere where the stairs don't have bad memories." I looked at the stairs. I could still see the spot where the toy truck had been. "I'm moving to a condo near the park," I told her. "It's got 1 floor, a pool, and a view of the mountains, and I've instructed Caldwell to set up a small educational fund within the trust." She looked up, a spark of hope in her eyes. "It's not for you," I said firmly, "and it's not for your debts. It's for you to go back to school if you want. It will pay the tuition directly to the university. Not a cent goes into your bank account. You want to be a lit teacher like your old man? Now's your chance to earn it." She didn't hug me. She didn't thank me with a performance. She just nodded, her eyes wet, and went back to packing. The closing on the house happened on a bright Monday in October. I sat in a conference room with Richard Caldwell, signing the final deed transfer. When the check was handed over, a staggering $580,000, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I drove to my new condo in Tempe. It was modern, clean, and best of all, the entryway was flat. I spent the afternoon unpacking only the things I truly loved: my books, my wife's favorite quilt, and the graduation photo of Jennifer. Douglas's trial was a quiet affair. He took a plea deal, 3 years of probation, a massive fine, and a permanent record for elder neglect. He moved back to his mother's house in another state, a broken man who had gambled his dignity and lost. I never saw him again. Jennifer stayed true to her word. She worked the administrative job by day and started her master's in education by night. She lived in her small apartment, paid her own way, and never once asked for a bridge loan or an expansion fund. Our Saturday lunches became a ritual of actual conversation, not tactical maneuvers. One Saturday, she arrived with a small box. Inside was a ceramic salt shaker, a replica of the one that had sat on our old dining room table for 20 years. "I found it at an antique shop," she said, placing it on my new kitchen counter. I thought, maybe we could start a new table. I looked at the shaker, then at my daughter. She wasn't the hero from the graduation photo, and she wasn't the monster from the stairs. She was a woman who had finally grown up, forced into maturity by the cold reality of her own choices. "It looks good there, Jenny," I said. Harold Chen moved a few months later to be closer to his grandkids, but we still talked on the phone once a week. He told me he'd never seen a man transform his life so completely at 64. I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the sun set over the Phoenix skyline. The desert air was cooling, and the lights of the city were beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. I opened a book of Hemingway's short stories and turned to the page we had discussed in the book club months ago. I thought about the night on the tile. I thought about the toy truck and the darkness. I realized then that the fall hadn't been the end of my life. It had been the impact that cracked the shell I'd been living in. I wasn't an ATM anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was a man who had his dignity, his autonomy, and a future that belonged entirely to him. I took a sip of my tea, the warmth spreading through my chest, and turned the page. The house was quiet, the bills were paid, and the stars were coming out. For the first time in 64 years, I knew exactly who I was, and I was finally, truly at peace. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.